Dr. Michael Zemel is Professor Emeritus at the University of Tennessee and the founder and Chief Scientific Officer at NuSirt, a company developing solutions to treat chronic diseases of aging and overnutrition. In his 40 years of academic research, he has authored more than 200 peer-reviewed publications. With that, let me start the interview. Hello, Dr. Zemel. You are the founder and Chief Scientific Officer of NuSirt. So welcome to Modern Healthspan, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, thank you so much for inviting me.
So, Dr. Zemel, can you provide a little bit of your background and what led you to found NuSirt? And it was quite some time ago that you actually founded it, I believe.
That's right. I founded it in 2007, 2008. Very cleverly tried to start a company in the middle of the financial crash. Didn't really get any investor interest till 2 or 3 years later, at which point the company took off, starting in 2010. My background is academic. I was for 30 plus years professor of nutrition, professor of endocrinology, first at Wayne State University and then at the University of Tennessee, and focused during most of that time on the chronic diseases that we would now define as chronic diseases of aging, but at the time we just considered them chronic diseases. Hypertension, insulin resistance, diabetes, obesity, fatty liver disease, non-alcoholic steatohepatitis, the more severe fatty liver disease, that sort of thing. Along the way, I focused both on basic mechanisms of disease as well as on clinical outcomes. I always kept a foot in both worlds. Always attempted to see if we could try to engage in some clinical application of our basic science. And we still very much do that. That's still very much what motivates myself and my colleagues. During my time at the university, in the early 2000s, got curious about the amino acid leucine. And the reason I got curious about it is because leucine is well known by anybody in the field to be an activator of mTOR. And that means it has a strong anabolic effect. And for those of your listeners who focus at all or pay any attention to lifespan pharmacology, they would know well that inhibition of mTOR is something that is more likely to extend our lifespan and certainly extend our health span. My curiosity started with simply wanting to know if leucine is stimulating anabolic processes, muscle building and the like, where does the energy come from? Because it's energetically expensive. You got to make new protein. That costs energy. You're going to burn energy in doing that. So we spent a few years trying to sort out where the energy came from. And it turned out that leucine directly signaled to increase fatty acid oxidation. I thought, well, that's curious. Something that is going to cause us to put building blocks together is also going to light a fire under those building blocks. That doesn't completely make sense to me. So as we chased this a little further, we came to understand that there was a concentration of leucine that is above ambient levels, but that actually stimulates fat oxidation without stimulating mTOR whatsoever. It's a little less than half, maybe 30 to 40% of the concentration that it takes to stimulate mTOR. So to put that in perspective, if you are fasting, your plasma leucine levels are going to be around 100 nanomolar, 1/10 of a micromolar. if you eat a high protein meal, high quality protein, meat or good vegetable alternative of high quality, and a lot of it, you're going to move your plasma leucine up to about a quarter of a micromolar, or maybe 0.3. That's not enough to do anything. It turns out we need to push it to closer to 0.5 micromolar or 500 nanomolar, or in that range, in order to stimulate fatty acid oxidation. Now, if you look at the literature on mTOR, it's a much higher concentration that's required to stimulate mTOR. In fact, it's pretty difficult to achieve that concentration of leucine by simply eating a high protein meal. It's extremely difficult to do so. It's extremely difficult to achieve the concentrations to activate fatty acid oxidation, but it's easier. I can give you a couple of tablets or capsules and get your leucine into the appropriate range, into that 0.5 micromolar range with no difficulty at all. And as we drilled down a little further, we found, because of course, once we found that it was fatty acid oxidation, the next question is why? How do you do that? What's the signal? And we found that the signal was sirtuin related, primarily SIRT1 related. And we found that even in a cell-free system, that leucine was a direct activator of SIRT1 at the right concentrations.
So going back a little bit, a more general question. So you say to eat, if you eat a large protein meal, then you will not reach the levels to stimulate mTOR from leucine. So how does mTOR ever get stimulated then, activated?
Well, it gets stimulated in a variety of ways, but it is not the leucine by itself at the ambient concentrations that are achieved by simply eating a high protein meal that do it. If you look at the literature in which shows leucine, and of course this is well-known literature, hundreds or more than hundreds of articles showing this happens, and I'm certainly not questioning it. If you look at that literature and then say, well, what's the concentration they use? You see that the concentration is higher. You see the concentration is more like 1.5 millimolar, micromolar, or 2. It's a much higher concentration of leucine. I'm sorry, I said nanomolar. I actually meant to talk about half micromolar, not half. I'm so sorry. Half millimolar. In any case, regardless. Regardless, you're talking about millimolar concentrations of leucine that are required to stimulate mTOR, and you don't get millimolar concentrations of leucine following a high protein meal. That doesn't mean you don't turn on mTOR, you decidedly do, but leucine is not the only driver of that. It is simply part of the package. So if you provide leucine by itself in a fasted state, I can provide leucine sufficient to activate SIRT1 without ever touching mTOR.
Right. Okay.
In other words, we can separate the mechanisms.
Yes. Okay. Need to think about that a bit. Okay. But if we have leucine at this kind of 0.5 millimolar, then it is going to encourage fat burning. Correct. Correct. Okay.
It's going to be more than that. What we see is a nice interaction, well-known interaction between SIRT1 and AMPK. So in addition to fat burning, you have some of the other downstream benefits of the SIRT1/AMPK pathway activation. Now, to be clear, let me just back up for a moment. Leucine by itself is not a drug. It's not even a particularly good supplement. It makes for some interesting academic papers. You can show these effects, and that's all very nice. the question that we asked, and this was really the start of the company, NuSirt, is how do we leverage that observation into some meaningful biology in human beings? Mm-hmm. And so we said, well, if this is what leucine does, might it interact with other direct or indirect sirtuin pathway activators?
Right.
And so what kicked us off was the observation that first, the answer to that question is yes. Mm-hmm. And that the synergy is rather robust.
Right.
So, for example, we started with resveratrol. And, by 2008, 9, 10, there are two things that everybody knew about resveratrol. One was that it had some interesting biology, and two, that biology was more or less irrelevant to human beings. You simply couldn't get enough resveratrol in most studies. And I know you can find a few outliers there, but you couldn't get enough resveratrol into human beings to generate a meaningful effect. Meaning, you might see a little biology, but biology and clinical effect isn't the same. We were after clinically meaningful effects, not academic papers. And so we started by asking the question, if we used levels of resveratrol that showed no effect on their own, and we added leucine, could we produce the same effect as very high dose resveratrol by itself? And the answer to that question was yes. It was yes in vitro, it was yes in mice, and it was yes in humans. And so, at that point, we had it in our minds that we would use this as a platform to develop a series of interesting nutraceuticals. And the more we thought about it, and the more we surveyed the landscape of the nutritional supplement industry, the more we realized that, or I shouldn't say realized, the more we were concerned that having robust data might not be enough to matter in order to be successful. Because there was plenty of folks who were selling products and doing well without robust data, or in some cases without any clinical data. And we thought, oh my goodness, how in the world can our data stack up against claims that are made without the strength of data? And so we did a hard pivot, and we said, let's shift this to a regulated space.
Right. So before we jump there, which I would definitely like to go to, I'd like to think a little bit more, or understand a little bit more about what you saw with resveratrol. Because I did see that you did do a human trial with resveratrol, and you are correct that a lot of the other resveratrol human trials, of which there's been quite a few, have not been very successful. I mean, yeah, there's been some success, but it's not like clear. So what did you see, and what kind of dosage were you using in that trial?
So good question. We based this on our mouse work, and this was just a demonstration trial. Okay. In our mouse work, we were able to see, with the combination, robust increases in fatty acid oxidation, robust reductions in adipose tissue mass, or modest decreases in adipose tissue mass, very robust improvements in insulin sensitivity, and reductions in inflammatory stress. So we did a 28-day clinical trial in individuals with impaired glucose tolerance, or if you prefer, pre-diabetics. And we looked at the leucine resveratrol combination, and the amount of leucine we use, this is well published, so there's nothing secretive about it, is a little over a gram, 1.1 grams, twice a day. And we paired that with a low dose of resveratrol. It was a 100 milligram dose of resveratrol. So a pretty low dose of resveratrol, divided doses. And what we saw in individuals with impaired glucose tolerance was an improvement in insulin sensitivity, reduction in insulin resistance, basically, reduction in circulating insulin, improvement in oral glucose tolerance test. A very simple 28-day study.
Right.
And of course, it's placebo-controlled and all of that. So this is randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled trial, and that was encouraging. There were nice effects. They were not as robust as I would want to see for a drug. But then again, you're dealing with pre-diabetics, not individuals with type 2 diabetes. And it's going to be hard to see a very robust effect in individuals who are not fully diabetic. There's a floor. You can't go below the floor. You're not going to make glucose plummet or insulin plummet. But it was enough for us to say, yes, there's interesting biology to develop there.
So if I take whey protein, suppose I eat whey protein, right? It's got about 2 grams of leucine in it, but it's got a lot of other amino acids at the same time. So would that have the same effect, or is it's got to be on leucine on its own, or do you know that?
I do know that. It is a wonderful question, and thank you for asking it. So here's what we know. The effects of leucine are unique to leucine. It is not manifested by other classes of amino acids, nor is it manifested by leucine's classmates in the family of branched chain amino acids. So isoleucine and valine do not have this effect. In addition, what we see is in the presence of other amino acids, and especially its classmates, isoleucine and valine, the effects of leucine are attenuated. So the answer to your question is taking whey protein, as good as it is for some things, is not going to achieve these effects. And we've looked.
So I assume that also that temporally it needs to be the same time, right? You need the leucine and the resveratrol at the same time.
Correct.
You also looked at NAD precursors in a similar way, although I think that was only preclinical.
That is correct. As I look at the landscape of NAD precursors, most notably nicotinamide riboside and nicotinamide mononucleotide, what we can say from a Healthspan perspective is they appear to be safe, at least in the short to intermediate term, meaning there have been a large number of studies that show little or no safety signal. That being said, if you look for actual clinically meaningful biology, you're going to have to squint very hard with nicotinamide riboside. You just don't see it. If you look at nicotinamide mononucleotide, there was an encouraging paper. Was it about a year ago, maybe a little more than a year ago? Nice paper that, if I recall correctly, it was a group of older women with insulin resistance. And there were some statistically significant and possibly clinically meaningful effects. They were not large magnitude, but it was something that one might build on if one were to do some dose optimization. So what I can say is there's not an overwhelming amount of evidence for clinical benefit of NAD precursors taken orally. And we were curious simply because when we looked at the mechanism of action of leucine, I mentioned earlier that it stimulates SIRT1. Well, fair question would be, how does it stimulate SIRT1? And the answer is it does so by reducing the Km, or increasing the affinity of NAD for SIRT1, such that a lower quantity of NAD would get you to an equivalent level of SIRT1 activation, right? So with that in mind, we thought it would be reasonable to think that there might be synergy between orally administered leucine and orally administered NAD precursors. And of course, we modeled that in some in vitro systems, and that looked very good. And we did the low-hanging fruit studies, the simple studies you can do in worms and C. elegans, and showed that we could do some nice lifespan extension kinds of things. And then finally, in mice, we showed that the combination, really worked quite nicely at concentrations where the NAD precursors had no effect on their own, and actually had lovely effects on lipid metabolism, actually reversal of atherosclerotic plaque, some lovely effects. The plaque experiment was in LDL receptor knockout mice, so that they were not an unreasonable model. That being said, I have zero clinical data, and we're not in the habit of making claims without clinical data. In fact, we absolutely will not do so.
Yes. But that's interesting.
On that, we have other clinical data.
Yes. Just one question. Did you see any difference between NR and NMN? Or were they very similar? Or did you compare them?
We ran them in separate studies. There was no head-to-head comparison. We did get, if there was a difference, I don't recall it being one that I thought very much about.
Yeah. Okay.
But that doesn't mean there won't be in humans.
Yes. Yes. Of course.
Don't forget that both NR and NMN have robust effects. Both of them have robust effects in mice.
Yes. Yeah, they do. Although I think the dosing is quite high, generally.
It is.
Yeah.
It is. And we brought the dosing down quite a bit.